all that Nicola Willis is doing is displacing the burden from government or us collectively as a country onto individual households. And we're seeing that reflected in growing inequality, growing poverty, and growing homelessness.
Green Party co-leader Chloe Swarbrick. Now, you think the government's fiscal framework is just too tight. What?
We think that it's based on a number of assumptions that are completely untethered rather from economic reality. And we think that right now the assumptions that are made tend to have us operate in a way that actually is undermining our real world economic capacity and ultimately contributing to compounding the crises of inequality and the climate crisis. So what we've put on the table with our alternative fiscal strategy is unpacking where some of those assumptions come from and why we frankly think that they are junk, and proposing some far more common sense proposals around what those assumptions could be, which lead us to a place where we can understand that public investment and public infrastructure is a good thing, and it ultimately lends itself towards actually greater financial stability, greater credibility, and that in turn reduces our risk.
I mean, I think you used in the paper an example of resilience, particularly climate resilience. I think making the point, with flooding, for instance, if there was better resilience in place, you'd be saving costs. Those are the sorts of things you're...
Yeah, so this is to be read in tandem with our green budget, whereby obviously we are also proposing a substantial amount of reform on the revenue side of things and a fairer tax system, all of which ultimately lend itself to that kind of credibility which the international markets are looking at. But yeah, ultimately you're also pointing to the fact that even from international firms with a bias towards overestimating the importance of private capital, that they're only going to fill approximately 40% of the gap when it comes to climate mitigation. So there is a role for an active state here. And I think after 40 years of the rules that we've had in place right now, New Zealanders can see the wheels falling off. Our fiscal rules are divorced from economic reality, let alone from people's real worlds.
You make a reference in the paper to the 1980s, and I can remember in the early 90s when net debt to GDP got to as high as 54%. But at that point, $1 in $5 taxpayers' dollars was being paid on servicing the debt. I mean, obviously that was money that then couldn't be spent on health and education. So how far are you prepared to let it go out where you'd say, oh, hold it, you're spending too much on debt servicing, and that would be money better spent on those sorts of services?
Yeah, so a number of points to unpack in that. One is the fact that those debt servicing on those interest rates are obviously going to be set by our perceived risk. And if you look at, papers even most recently as last week from the IMF, you'll see very clearly that international credit ratings agencies like Standard & Poor's as well, and the IMF and otherwise have a far more sophisticated understanding of our financial stability and our ability to pay back debt than we ourselves seem to have in our own fiscal rules. That takes into account, the fact that we currently have a substantial infrastructural deficit, high levels of private debt, and also this productivity crisis. We are only meaningfully going to be able to address those issues with serious investment, which means all of us collectively and democratically making those decisions to invest in the things that are good for New Zealanders' lives, but also improve our economic resilience and in turn mitigate that risk as perceived by international markets.
The government set this target of 20 to 40% of GDP. The Treasury had recommended 50%,
cap,
although it said, we could go up to 90. But so what, you'd be looking at up to 90% as a figure that the Greens would be?
So, look, we have basically outlined that 90% figure and that 40% reduction actually. That 40% figure is the equivalent of 2 COVID-19 responses. Yeah. So, it's huge. But more so than that, and looking at all of the different variables that are taken into account and the kind of assumptions in terms of economic growth rates and other ways that Treasury takes into account, that we can still have relatively conservative assumptions being made, but that we can take on far higher levels of debt. To come back to the real world, though, again, what these international markets and those who are giving us that line of credit are looking at is our financial stability, is the credibility and the transparency of our spending plans. And that's what the Greens are really proud to have put on the table, is an entirely credible and an entirely transparent spending plan to invest in real-world economic capacity, to invest in our productivity, to invest in improving people's lives and ultimately in that resilience, which in turn reduces that risk.
So your argument is, I mean, you're not just talking about spending willy-nilly.
Absolutely not.
It's about where you spend the money and where you focus it.
We're talking about common sense investment in our common good. We're talking about tackling the dual crises of the climate crisis and the inequality crises, and doing so with consideration for the real world economy. And this is, I think, part of the just idiocy and the illogic of where we get to if we're to take the current fiscal and economic approach of the current government, whereby they are ostensibly cutting back spending in order to, I don't know, if you're to listen to Nicola Willis, improve our growth, when in fact all it seemed to have really done, again, if you're to look at the commentary from many economists, is in fact contract growth, contract private spending, obviously contracting public spending as well. As a result in the loss of 11,000 construction jobs, means that 500,000 New Zealanders are accessing food banks every single week. 191 New Zealanders are leaving the country every single day, 2/3 of them between the ages of 18 to 45. If Minister Willis has concerns about the ageing population, she's actively contributing to it.
In the paper too, you make a reference, I think, to the way the government has portrayed the Green Party's policies, I think, as clown economics.
Yeah.
So how much is the political argument here important for you to
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to be quite frank with you, obviously, we're going up against 40 years, 4 decades of deeply ingrained neoliberal rhetoric. I think it was best summarised by Margaret Thatcher, the economic project to transform our cultural landscape, when she said there is no such thing as a society, there is merely individual men and women, which, came hand in hand with a shredding of kind of the social contract, and has led to people feeling not only as though they're in constant competition with each other, but also as though, we're all in this constant state of crisis. The proposition that the Greens are putting on the table at a really high level is that we can reject that. We can decide to collaborate and create the kind of country that we want to live in together, because we're not 5 million random isolated individuals. We are New Zealanders. And with the wheels falling off of this thing that we call the economy, we can decide to reimagine this thing, and we can decide to put in place rules that actually reflect our real world economy.
But I mean, the political argument the government puts out about how much debt each New Zealander carries as part of this, and of course most New Zealanders have debt of their own.
Yep.
They struggle with mortgages and the like. So I mean, it's quite a strong political argument. So
again, divorced from economic reality, because, if you were to look at the real world correlation to a withdrawal of government spending, particularly on infrastructure and the kind of services that New Zealanders rely on, you then see a correlation in increased private debt. So in fact, all that Nicola Willis is doing is displacing the burden from government, or us collectively as a country, onto individual households. And we're seeing that reflected in growing inequality, growing poverty, and growing homelessness.
So from here, how do you intend to continue, to run this campaign that you've got going? I mean, obviously it's a build-up through to next year's election.
Yeah, we're getting a bunch of brain boxes in the room on Tuesday morning, including Ian Ball, who, as you know, had quite a lot to do with the Public Finance Act. So this is all part and parcel of starting to, from a really credible perspective, showcase some of our thinking, and also starting to unpack some of those assumptions that we think, frankly, are junk. We're really proud to be leading the conversation here and setting the agenda, putting something out there that we expect to be critiqued. We are really looking forward to the public debate that should ensue as a result of us putting these ideas on the table. Flowing from that, as you've already kind of alluded to, there is the political reality, which is that we then have to get out there, boots on the ground, and talk to people about things. So that's why we're really proud to be doing the work that we are right now across the country, and talking to people about our green budget and the kind of political choices that we can make, especially in the context of the kind of political choices that the government has decided to make. The government is telling New Zealanders that it's going for growth, when in reality all it seems to be actually growing are climate changing emissions, inequality, homelessness and poverty. What we are focused on is improving people's lives, and you can see that reflected in the investment choices that we would make and the sound economic analysis that sits behind it.